As has been said, today is an important day in the life of our church as we collectively commit to giving above and beyond our regular giving. But last Sunday was also an important day for myself and my wife as I celebrated 5 years of being your lead pastor here at the church. And you can see a photo on the screen of my induction five years ago and 1 week. It was a great day that for me felt like the culmination of many months of preparation by God. Now, initially I'd put in my application for the role in January, but I didn't start until the 29th of September. I had given my previous church, Life Point Baptist Church on the Sunshine Coast, about 3 months' notice after I was accepted by the membership here to become the lead pastor. One of the things that I appreciated so much after I gave my notice when I was at Life Point is that the senior pastor, Phil, he really took me under his wing and he tried to equip me and develop me the best way possible so that I might be as ready as possible coming into this role here. Now, there are so many different things about this role that I'm doing now compared to being an associate pastor, but the area that I had very little experience in and asked Phil the most questions about was a level of managing church finances. Now at Bracken, this is a role shared between Alex, our operations director, myself and the church council, along with approval by the members. But there is a level of accountability that I have as the lead pastor to ensure that our finances are being used in the most effective way to advance the kingdom of God. And this is not a small responsibility. We're working with over $500,000 per year, not including our building fund finances. So this is a significant amount of resources to be handled as a church. And so I spoke to my senior pastor at the time about this, and he kept coming back to me with this one word, which was stewardship, being a faithful steward. Merriam-Webster Dictionary defines stewardship like this: the conducting, supervising, or managing of something, especially the careful and responsible management of something entrusted into one's care. Ultimately, a steward is someone who takes care of something that has been entrusted to them by someone else. Now, although this is not a term, stewardship is not a term used commonly in secular workplaces, this is something that workers are doing all of the time. Accountants, they will steward money for someone else. Stockbrokers will steward shares for someone else. Workers will steward the time that they have been entrusted with. Bosses steward the authority that they have been given. If you have ever been entrusted with something by someone else to manage well, you have been a steward. But in Scripture, this term takes on a higher level of meaning. We are all stewards who have been given time, gifts, and resources by God, and we have a limited time here on this earth to be able to use them wisely and use them faithfully. Although stewardship in the Bible speaks broadly to stewarding all of our resources, it has a tight link when it speaks to finances in particular. The English word economics and economy, they come from the Greek word oikonomia, which is made up of two parts, which is oikos, the word for house or household, and nomos, the word for law. So oikos and nomos together literally mean house law. Oikonomia is transliterated into English as economy. The English word that translates rather than transliterates the word oikonomia is the English word stewardship. So, stewardship and economics are closely related topics. And in fact, to a New Testament Christian, there is no distinction between the two. But you don't just have to go to the New Testament to see this idea of stewardship and stewarding the resources that God has given us. This is what Adam and Eve were doing at the very beginning in the garden. God gives Adam a command to rule over the earth. That's what man is entrusted with. And mankind is to steward this creation well. You have stewardship wound up into the very fabric of creation at the very beginning. But the person who comes to my mind first when I think of this idea of being a good steward is the person of Joseph. Joseph, as many of you would know, he was sold into slavery by his brothers because of jealousy, which began a string of events throughout Joseph's life. One of the first things that happens to Joseph in slavery is that he's discovered by Potiphar, who was the captain of the Egyptian king's guard. And Joseph effectively became a steward for Potiphar and his wife. And we see this in Genesis 39, verses 1 to 6. It says this in Genesis 39. Now Joseph had been taken down to Egypt. Potiphar, an Egyptian who was one of Pharaoh's officials, the captain of the guard, bought him from the Ishmaelites who had taken him there. The Lord was with Joseph so that he prospered, and he lived in the house of his Egyptian master. When his master saw that the Lord was with him and that the Lord gave him success in everything he did, Joseph found favor in his eyes and became his attendant, his steward. Potiphar put him in charge of his household, and he entrusted to his care everything he owned. From the time he put him in charge of his household and of all that he owned, the Lord blessed the household of the Egyptian because of Joseph. The blessing of the Lord was on everything Potiphar had, both in the house and in the field. So Potiphar left everything he had in Joseph's care with Joseph in charge. He did not concern himself with anything except for the food he ate. So here you have Joseph, who has quickly gone from being sold into slavery to becoming the primary offsider to Potiphar. Joseph does such a good job at looking after everything for Potiphar that Potiphar doesn't have to worry about anything. Everything is just entrusted into Joseph's care. That's how good of a steward that Joseph was. He managed what wasn't his. He stewarded it to an extent where there was no worry for his boss at all. Now we know that things didn't stay this way. Potiphar's wife developed this strong crush on Joseph, which led to Joseph being thrown into prison. And at this point for Joseph, it would have felt like everything was hopeless. But once again, God desires to increase what is under Joseph. And so he goes from being the chief steward for Potiphar to becoming the chief steward for the king of Egypt, who was Pharaoh. And then you see the result of this just over a couple of pages in Genesis 41 to 57. It says, so Pharaoh said to Joseph, I hereby put you in charge of the whole land of Egypt. Then Pharaoh took his signet ring from his finger and put it on Joseph's finger. He dressed him in robes of fine linen and put a gold chain around his neck. He made him ride a chariot as his second in command. And people shouted before him, make way. Thus he put him in charge of the whole land of Egypt. Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, I am Pharaoh, but without your word, no one will lift a hand or foot in all Egypt. Pharaoh gave Joseph the name Zaphanath, and gave him Asenath, daughter of Potiphar, priest of On, to be his wife. And Joseph went throughout the land of Egypt. Joseph was 30 years old when he entered the service of Pharaoh, king of Egypt. And Joseph went out of Pharaoh's presence and traveled throughout Egypt. 7 years of abundance, the land produced plentifully. Joseph collected all the food produced in those 7 years of abundance in Egypt and stored it in the cities. In each city, he put grain in the fields surrounding it. Joseph stored up huge quantities of grain, like the sand of the sea. It was so much that he stopped keeping records because it was beyond measure. Before the years of famine came, 2 sons were born to Joseph by Asenath, daughter of Potiphar, priest of On. Joseph named his firstborn Manasseh and said, it is because God has made me forget all my trouble and all my father's household. The second son he named Ephraim and said, it is because God has made me fruitful in the land of my suffering. The 7 years of abundance in Egypt came to an end, and the 7 years of famine began. just as Joseph had said. There was famine in all the other lands, but in the whole land of Egypt there was food. When all Egypt began to feel the famine, the people cried to Pharaoh for food. And then Pharaoh told all the Egyptians, "Go to Joseph and do what he tells you." When the famine had spread all over the country, Joseph opened all the storehouses and sold grain to the Egyptians. For the famine was severe throughout Egypt, and all the world came to Egypt to buy grain from Joseph because the famine was severe everywhere. In 2011, there was a movie that came out called Machine Gun Preacher. Who here has seen Machine Gun Preacher? A few of you have seen Machine Gun Preacher. Thank you so much, Cheryl. This movie, it featured Gerard Butler, who you can see on the left, playing the real-life character Sam Childers, who you can see on the right. It tells this story of Sam Childers, a former gang biker turned preacher, and his efforts to protect the children of South Sudan from the LRA, which is the Lord's Resistance Army. The story has two ongoing themes throughout the entire movie. Firstly, there is the story of Sam rescuing children and opening up orphanages to be able to house those displaced by the LRA. And secondly, there is Sam's relationship with his family. Sam starts to consider all of their problems pretty petty and pathetic. He becomes angrier towards them, and he begins to despise the comparative wealth that they have compared to the children that he has been rescuing. There is a scene that makes you quite uncomfortable where his daughter comes and asks if she is able to share a cheap limo with 5 other friends for her school formal. But her father refuses because he sees this as a waste of money. The mother tries to convince him that it's not that much money, but Sam becomes more and more aggressive and angrier. He begins to swear to his entire family. And this scene is designed to make you feel really uncomfortable. But there is something within you that kind of knows that what he is saying has somewhat of a point. But it also makes you feel uncomfortable how he is treating his own daughter and denying her certain basic requests. Now, I have obviously never been in that situation, but I have been in situations where I have almost felt a little bit guilty because of where I live. In the 90s and early 2000s, there was a very hard prosperity gospel that was being taught in many churches. An idea was taught that if you give more, God will bless you more financially and with good health, and you can spend that money on whatever you want. But the pendulum began to swing in the early 2000s towards a hard poverty gospel. The idea that every disciple should give up everything that they have, they should live with just enough to survive and give every other bit of money away. Now, there are elements of both of these ends of the spectrum that hold merit when they are held in tension with one another. However, the extremes, like with everything, they are destructive and they are harmful to believers. In particular, I remember sitting in a congregation one night service, and we had a guest preacher who said that we were in the top 1% of richest people in the world, and because of that, we should be ashamed of how much we own and what we buy. It was essentially pushed to the point where he was trying to make people feel guilty for owning a house and driving a car if there are people around the world who are unable to eat. Now, I remember sitting in the congregation as a young adult and thinking, I saw the car that this guy drove in with, and it is 10 times nicer than my car. I was driving 1989 Corolla at that time. I also thought, I've seen this guy's house on Facebook. This guy lives in a far nicer house than me, and a far nicer house than I will probably ever live in. It felt quite hypocritical to teach this message of poverty when this guy's life didn't seem to align with the message that he was preaching. So based on that, do I just throw out everything that he had to say, or should I take on board some of what he said? There were certain truths in what this preacher said. In 2022, what Alex was sharing this morning, at the moment we're classed as the fourth richest nation, but in 2022, Australians were called the richest people in the world. I recently looked up our rough family income, and a certain website said that we are in the top 4.5% of the richest of the global population. So what do you do with information like that? Should everyone in this room and watching online feel guilty because we live in Australia and have comparatively some more wealth when compared to many other nations? Throughout the Bible, there are examples of poor people who have nothing, who do great things for God. And Jesus is number one. Jesus was a poor person. He relied on hospitality from others and taught more than anyone else on the dangers of excessive wealth. But throughout the Bible, there are also many examples of more wealthy people who do great things for God. In the Old Testament, you have Moses, who started out as a prince of Egypt. You have Solomon, King David. In the New Testament, you have Peter, who is a very successful business owner. You have Luke, who is a well-off doctor. You have Matthew, who is a tax collector. You have Philemon, who is clearly quite wealthy. Many pastors in the early church were the people who owned the homes where churches would come and gather. This meant that often the pastors were the most well-off and most well-trained people within the whole church because they needed large homes to be able to gather the church. But Joseph in particular, he sets a perfect example for us of what it means to be a good steward of what we have. Joseph didn't just become rich in his society, he became Elon Musk rich. He would have been in the top 0.0001% of the richest people in the world in that day. And the word, particularly in Genesis 39, is that God blessed him. And that blessing is far more broad than just material blessing. There is this special blessing that he receives from God that is repeated again and again. And Joseph doesn't just throw his wealth away without thought or without strategy. He is immensely thoughtful and wise in how he stewards the resources that have been entrusted into his hands by both Potiphar and Pharaoh, but more importantly, by God. And there are three ways that we can see that Joseph is strategic and wise in how he stewards what has been entrusted to him well. So 3 simple points for you to remember today. Firstly, a faithful steward invests. Just prior to what we read in Genesis 41, we see that Joseph interpreted a dream from Pharaoh of 7 years of plentiful crops, followed by 7 years of famine. Joseph is placed in charge of everything by Pharaoh to make sure that Egypt will be okay. And so he begins collecting the harvest, putting it away for the future. It says Joseph stored up quantities of grain like the sand of the sea. It was so much that he stopped keeping records because it was beyond measure. So he is investing his resources into the future. When we speak about investing in the 21st century, we will generally have the thought of things like shares or property or Bitcoin. They're often these stagnant things that will grow value over time. Over time, the value grows and grows and grows. But the key is that it doesn't exist just to grow. Once grown to a certain point, it is there to be used. Jesus is very clear in the parable of the rich fool that resources that we have, including money, are not there to just sit getting bigger and bigger and bigger. At some stage, they are there to be used. But likewise, Jesus, in the parable of the talents, speaks to the importance of investing and the potential of growing what already exists. And this is what Joseph does. His harvest wouldn't have been worth that much during the years of plenty, but during the years of scarcity, that would have been worth everything. And the thing I love about Joseph here is that he makes the move and pulls the switch on using what has been invested. And the way he uses this is on other people. In verse 48 it says, in each city he put the food grown in the fields surrounding it. That might sound quite simple to us, but that's a fairly shocking statement for the time. Usually all of the best food and the most food would have been shipped to the capital where the Pharaoh lived. He would have been provided with more than enough and have the very best crops, and then the worst would have been sent to the poorer people who lived further away from the capital. But here Joseph invests into the nation as a whole by giving everyone the first fruits of what they had worked for. And it meant that during the years of famine, Egypt still had more than enough. Now, as Christians, some people can have an issue with the language of financial investment. But I want to suggest that firstly, there is nothing wrong with the idea of investing. But secondly, in what we are doing here today for Commitment Sunday, giving a certain amount of money to our building appeal in particular is investing into the future. Joseph set aside resources for the benefit of the nation of Israel, of Egypt. He was investing into the people's future. And I want to suggest that you are investing into our future and our children's future and our grandchildren's future. As I said at the start of our time, I've been here for 5 years. But some people, and some of you people here today, have been key people who have invested into this space that we're sitting in right now. You have invested in the past so that we can be worshipping as a community today. This happened even before I was born. And your investment into this church, and yes, even into this building, is not just investing into bricks and mortar. It's ultimately investing into current generations and future generations, being able to hear the life, freedom, and hope found in Jesus. Many people who invested into this building in the past, they did so before I was even alive. And a couple of years ago, I shared a video of this building when it first opened in 1986. I was only born in 1990, 4 years later. In this video, there is also some music from a previous Bracken Baptist Church album. And what I want to do this morning is just show this video again so that you can see some of the faces who have invested into the past so that we can be sitting here today. So just turn your eyes to the screen.
Of the Bracken Baptist Church, this is the culmination of something like 8 years of planning.
Who would have thought that when services began in the TAFE College just 6.5 years ago, that there would be such a vital church fellowship as we have now in Bracken Ridge. Under the leadership of Pastor Ted Brett, whom I'm pleased to see here today with his wife, later supported by myself as a team, the fellowship made steady progress and soon turned its thoughts towards building for the future needs of the work.
Our church secretary, Ralph Brett. Stay there. Church secretary's job is not an easy job. He has to coordinate, he has to work together and bring it all together. And he's been working there as a member of the building committee. He's been working as the secretary of the church on the administration committee. He's had his contribution in the pastorate committee. He is a vital man in the life of a Baptist church. And he does so much work behind the scenes that so many people don't really know what he does. And I would like to say how much we've appreciated, Ralph, what you have done. And I know you're going to make a statement now concerning some of the things in the church life. But the members of our congregation and others would like to express their appreciation to you for what you've done.
Of course, it's the beginning of a new era of ministry. We don't sit back now and say, well, we've got a building we have a great work to do, and we are just trusting God to show us the direction. We know there are many needs, and in his guidance day by day, we expect that many people will see miracles of grace in their lives, and children will be brought to a knowledge of Christ, and there'll be an effort to train them in good citizenship and to commit their lives in continuing service to the Lord.
You choose to begin, though I may not see your plan. Break down my edges that wound you again. May I be soft in your hands. Fill my heart with your praise. May it echo all my days. Fill my heart with your love, for it holds me fast. May my heart be so full, I will follow you until the brittle mantle of this world has left my soul. And I know your emptying has made me whole. For your spirit comes and fills my empty soul.
Before we go any further, can you just raise your hand if you were there on that day or around or a part of the church during that time? Raise your hand. Can we give these people a big round of applause? Those of you who were there on that day, and many of you who are part of this church since, you have been faithful stewards in the past, and you have invested into this community, and I just want to say thank you. Faithful stewards are those who invest, because investing, it looks to the future. But a faithful steward is also one who increases. If you go back to Joseph and Potiphar in Genesis 39, Joseph is entrusted with everything that he owned. Every single thing that Potiphar has is given to Joseph to look after. This guy Potiphar, he was the captain of the guard for Pharaoh. This is the closest thing, probably the closest thing we could think of today would be the head of the Secret Service for the President of the USA. This was a very, very, very important position, which didn't just hold military power, but it also held political power. The person who was Potiphar, who was the captain of the guard, they had such close contact with Pharaoh that they were someone who could speak into many of the decisions that Pharaoh would make. So Potiphar had this high level of power in Egypt during that time. It would have been really easy for Joseph, being the primary steward for Potiphar, to simply say that he would sit back and just watch over what Potiphar owned in a really relaxed way, but that's not what happens. It seems that everything that Potiphar owned, it increased exponentially. It speaks about God blessing Joseph. So God was active in this, but the focus is even more on the part of Joseph and the fact that he was diligent with increasing what he had been given. Now, what I'm not saying is that every Christian should feel obliged to earn a lot of money. I'm not saying that every Christian should consider it God's blessing and approval automatically if they have money. I'm also not saying that we should just go out just to make more money to keep for ourselves. What I am saying, what we see in Joseph, if you have been given an ability to make a lot of money, then do that. But also give a lot of money. We all have different giving capacities in what we are able to, we all have different capacities in what we are able to earn throughout our lives. And at different points and seasons, this is going to look different. But don't ever feel guilty about being someone who is able to make money. In fact, if you are able, able to, increase that in your own life to the point where it won't affect your relationship with Jesus or with other people. If you have increased what you earn, increase also what you're able to give. I used to know a guy who was an amazing entrepreneur. From a very young age, he was able to make a lot of money very easily, and everything that he started was successful. The thing I most admired about this guy, though, was that he never saw his ability to earn a lot as something that was for him. He was immensely generous with what he earned. At one stage, he decided to invite me to stay at the Gold Coast in this fairly luxury apartment that he had paid for. We went out for meals together and he bought all of them. He was really generous with what he had, and he saw it as his responsibility to increase what he had so that he could be more generous. For us as good stewards as a church together, we want to be good stewards of what we have as a community. This means investing into our future through our building projects, but it also means increasing what we have here right now. So many of our ministries, they are doing so well at the moment in our church. So much ministry takes place officially here through our church, and then that leads to organic, beautiful relationships and discipleship happening at all these different places, even away from this place. And we believe in increasing what we already have for right now. And that's why we believe that it's important to be good stewards and increase our ministries as a church. And so 25% of your giving for Commitment Sunday will be going towards our current ministries and work, because we want to see the increase that is happening right now continue on into the future. And finally, a faithful steward influences. Joseph grew his influence to the point where he was then more influential than Potiphar. This is something that has always been left out of this story that I want to go and ask God one day, and I've always wondered. How did Joseph and Potiphar get along after Joseph became more important than Potiphar? Joseph is originally the steward of Potiphar, he's number 2, but later he becomes the steward of Pharaoh. So he's number 2 to the king. He becomes more powerful than the person who threw him into prison, even when he did nothing wrong. I'd love to have seen what the conversations were between those two afterwards. Joseph and Potiphar, they would have now worked in close proximity with one another, and I've always wondered how they got along. I bet that Potiphar sucked up a lot, because Joseph could have thrown him into prison then if he really wanted to. But Joseph, he doesn't do that, not that we see anyway. He uses his newfound influence for tremendous good, not just for the people of Egypt, but for people all around the world. It says that there were people coming from all around the world to Egypt to see Joseph so that he might be able to provide food for them during the years of famine. Joseph's influence, it is constantly building and building and building, and eventually it reaches this stage where he has international influence. All of us, we have our own circles of influence, and we are likely to not have the same level of influence as Joseph. Even the most important person in this room is not likely to become as influential as Joseph during this time. But you have people who you are able to influence and reach, who I am not able to influence and reach. You can reach people that I can't reach and will never be able to. And that's the same for me. I can reach people that you are unable to. But the key for us as a church community is when we realize our collective good together as a church and the influence that we can have together on this world for Jesus. In our members' information packs, one of the things that you'll be able to see is that last financial year, we gave over $40,000 to local and global missions work. This has always been a passion of this church because we don't see our influence as just being here in this room, but far beyond, including to other nations around the world. This Commitment Sunday, seeking to be good stewards who influence broadly, we want to set aside 10% of what is committed and given towards missions, in particular, as Alex was saying before, to the Harlands. Luke and Belle and the whole family, they are valued parts of our church, and we felt this, and they had a strong sense from God to do the ministry that they're doing in Thailand. But recently, as I said, the bottom level of their house, it was flooded, filled with mud, to the point where it destroyed everything in the lower part of their house. And this has set them back a long way from being able to do the work that they feel called to. And so we're setting aside 10% of what is committed and given this Commitment Sunday to the Harland family. We believe that they are able to reach and influence people where we are not able to do that. And so as stewards responsible for the resources that God has given us, we believe that they can influence the people that they are surrounded by for Jesus. In saying all of this, it's not my goal this morning, it's not anyone's goal to pressure or coax you into giving a certain amount of money. It's not my goal to convince you or push you towards giving to another cause. What my hope is today is that we together might faithfully steward our resources together as a church family, so that we can see many, many, many more people today and into the future come into a saving knowledge of Jesus. I can speak to us together as a church family, and I can help you understand why we're stewarding what we have in a certain way. But apart from corporately stewarding our resources well, you have the responsibility as an individual apprentice of Jesus to be faithful with your resources, your time, your energy, your gifts that God has given to you. And so it's up to you to steward not your resources, but God's resources in which He has entrusted to you. I'm just going to invite the team to come up right now. Thanks, team. And so during this next song, I want to give you the opportunity to, you can either stand or sit, it doesn't matter as we sing this next song. And I want to give you the opportunity to fill out one of these commitment cards. There are commitment cards in the front of these boxes here. There are some on the table as well. There are pens on the tables. There are these 2 tables and one at the back as well. And what you're able to do is you fill out these cards. You can either commit to giving over the next, over this financial year, or you can commit to giving within the next couple of weeks. And I want to give you this opportunity to either fill out one of these cards or simply pray about what you might fill out at a later point. Some of you might not have thought about this just until this morning. This doesn't have to be done today if you haven't thought about it at all. But if God is placing something on your heart right now to give, can I encourage you to not waver? Be led by the Spirit as He speaks to you in this moment, and write that number down and place that card in one of the boxes provided. It can be in any one of these boxes. There is something that happens for us when we respond, not just in an intellectual way, but when we respond physically to what God is saying to us. So throughout this next song, you can either sit or you can stand. It doesn't matter. Just invite you, if you are led this morning, I don't want to pressure you in any way, but if you are being led to respond and steward your own resources well and commit to giving towards the work that is happening here in our own community, I want to invite you to come and fill out one of these cards and place it in one of the boxes. As I said, if you haven't thought about this morning, I invite you to pray, use this time to pray genuinely, authentically about what God might have you commit to giving. God is able to accomplish great things through us together as a church community. Let me pray. God, as we respond this morning, I really pray against any sort of hardness that anyone might be feeling right now, or thinking that what we have is just our stuff. It's our hard-earned things that we should be able to enjoy. But God, I really do pray for a spirit of generosity in the room today. God, you have entrusted every single one of us with certain resources and abilities and time, and we want to use those things wisely. But particularly when it comes to this issue of finances, we want to be really good stewards of what we have been given. We don't want to have hearts of generosity. We want to be able to be people who invest into the future, who increase what we have right now, but who also desire to influence our world for Jesus. So we do ask, God, would you speak to every single one of us by your Spirit? Help us to not waver or not overthink things, but to be led by your Spirit right now. In Jesus' name, amen. Just invite you during this next song, please come.